Sarah Martinez walked through the gates of Fort Braxton with her head held high, despite the curious stares from soldiers twice her size. At 28, she looked younger than her years, with shoulder-length brown hair pulled back in regulation style and dark eyes that seemed to hold secrets. The military jacket hung loose on her small frame, making her appear even more fragile than she already looked to the hardened men around her. Colonel James Harrison watched from his office window as the new recruit made her way across the compound. He shook his head in disgust, wondering what the higher-ups were thinking when they approved her transfer to his unit. Fort Braxton was known for its elite training programs, not a place for delicate flowers who would wilt at the first sign of real military pressure. "She won't last a week," he muttered to his aide, Captain Morrison, who stood beside him observing the same scene. "Look at her. She's walking like she's afraid her own shadow might attack her." Captain Morrison nodded in agreement, though something about the woman's determined stride caught his attention. There was a purposefulness in her movement that didn't match her appearance, but he kept his observation to himself. Colonel Harrison had already made up his mind, and contradicting him rarely ended well for anyone. Sarah knew she was being watched and judged. She had experienced the same reception at every base she had been transferred to over the past 5 years. The whispers followed her everywhere, soldiers wondering how someone so small and seemingly fragile had made it through basic training, let alone earned a spot in specialized units. What they didn't know, what no one knew, was that her appearance was both her greatest weakness and her most powerful weapon. The first day of training began at dawn. Colonel Harrison had designed a particularly brutal obstacle course, hoping to weed out anyone who didn't belong in his unit. He stood at the starting line, his weathered face set in a permanent scowl as he addressed the 20 soldiers gathered before him. "Welcome to hell," he announced, his voice carrying across the training ground. "This course will separate the soldiers from the pretenders. Those who can't keep up don't belong here." His eyes lingered on Sarah, who stood at attention with the rest of the group. She seemed even smaller, surrounded by the muscular men and women who made up the unit, her regulation uniform doing nothing to hide her slight build. Several soldiers exchanged glances, already placing bets on how quickly she would drop out. The obstacle course was a nightmare of rope climbs, wall scaling, mud crawls, and endurance challenges designed to push even the strongest soldiers to their limits. As the group began, Sarah found herself quickly falling behind. Her smaller stature made the rope climbs particularly difficult, and she struggled with the wall scaling that came naturally to her taller, stronger companions. Colonel Harrison followed the group's progress with his usual critical eye, but he paid special attention to Sarah's performance. Each time she fell behind, each moment she struggled confirmed his initial assessment. When she slipped and fell into the mud pit during one of the crawling exercises, emerging covered head to toe in thick brown sludge, he couldn't hide his satisfied smirk. "Having trouble keeping up, Martinez?" he called out as she pulled herself from the pit, breathing heavily. "Maybe you should consider a transfer to a desk job where the biggest challenge is a paper cut." Sarah wiped mud from her face and looked directly at him. For a moment, something flickered in her eyes that made the colonel pause, but it was gone so quickly he wondered if he had imagined it. Without saying a word, she rejoined the group and continued the course. The other soldiers began to show varying levels of sympathy and annoyance as Sarah continued to struggle. Some offered quiet encouragement when the colonel wasn't looking, while others grew frustrated with the delays her difficulties caused. The unit was supposed to function as a cohesive team, and having a weak link could endanger everyone during real missions. By the end of the first day, Sarah had completed the course, but she was dead last by a significant margin. Her uniform was torn in several places. Her face was scratched from low-hanging branches, and exhaustion was written across every line of her body. As the other soldiers headed to the mess hall, chatting about their performance and making plans for the evening, Sarah lingered behind, staring at the obstacle course that had defeated her so thoroughly. Colonel Harrison approached her, his boots crunching on the gravel path. "Second thoughts, Martinez?" "It's not too late to request a transfer. Save yourself and the unit the embarrassment of watching you fail spectacularly during a real mission." Sarah turned to face him, and again he caught that brief flash of something deeper in her expression. "Permission to speak freely, sir?" "Granted. I didn't come this far to quit on the first day, Colonel. I've faced worse challenges than a muddy obstacle course." Harrison laughed. a harsh sound that echoed across the empty training ground. Worse challenges? What could possibly be worse for someone like you? A broken nail? A bad hair day? The insult hit its mark and Sarah's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. But instead of responding with anger, she simply nodded. "I'll do better tomorrow, sir." As she walked away toward the barracks, Colonel Harrison shook his head again. The woman was either incredibly naive or incredibly stupid. Either way, she would be gone within a week, probably less. He had seen dozens of soldiers who thought determination alone could overcome physical limitations, and they all eventually learned the hard way that the military wasn't a place for wishful thinking. That night, Sarah sat alone in her bunk, carefully cleaning and bandaging the various cuts and scrapes from the day's training. The other soldiers in her barracks were friendly enough, but there was a distance there, a hesitation to fully accept someone who might not be able to watch their backs when it mattered. She understood their caution and didn't blame them for it. As she prepared for sleep, Sarah's hand unconsciously moved to her shoulder, pressing against the fabric of her shirt. Underneath, hidden from view, was a reminder of why she had joined the military in the first place, why she pushed herself through every challenge, despite her obvious physical disadvantages. Tomorrow would bring new tests, new opportunities for Colonel Harrison to doubt her abilities, but she would endure them all. She had survived much worse than the judgment of a skeptical commanding officer, though he didn't know that yet. The story of Sarah Martinez was just beginning, and the colonel had no idea what he was truly dealing with. The second week of training brought new challenges that seemed specifically designed to expose Sarah's weaknesses. Colonel Harrison had implemented hand-to-hand combat sessions, weapons training, and team-building exercises that required physical strength and coordination. Each day, Sarah found herself struggling more than the others, confirming what everyone already believed about her capabilities. During combat training, she was paired with Sergeant Thompson, a man who stood 6 feet 4 inches and had arms like tree trunks. The exercise was supposed to be controlled, focusing on technique rather than brute force, but Thompson's natural advantages made it impossible for Sarah to demonstrate any real skill. She spent most of the session on the ground, picked up and thrown around like a rag doll. "Is this supposed to be training or babysitting?" Thompson muttered after helping Sarah to her feet for the 5th time. He wasn't deliberately cruel, just frustrated with the obvious mismatch. How is she supposed to help any of us in a real fight? Colonel Harrison observed every moment of Sarah's struggles with growing satisfaction. His initial assessment had been correct, and now he had weeks of evidence to support his recommendation for her transfer. During the weapons training, her smaller hands had difficulty properly gripping some of the larger firearms, affecting her accuracy. The team exercises showed how her physical limitations slowed down the entire group. Martinez, the colonel called out after a particularly difficult session where Sarah had caused her team to lose a capture the flag exercise. "My office now." Sarah followed him across the compound, ignoring the sympathetic looks from some soldiers and the relieved expressions from others. She knew what was coming. She had been through this conversation before at other bases, with other commanding officers who had reached the same conclusion about her fitness for military service. The colonel's office was spartanly decorated with military commendations, photographs of past units, and a large American flag hanging behind his desk. He gestured for Sarah to sit in the chair across from him, but she chose to remain standing at attention. "At ease, Martinez," he said, settling into his own chair and studying her with critical eyes. "I'm going to speak plainly because I believe you deserve honesty. You don't belong here. This isn't about discrimination or personal bias. It's about capability and the safety of the soldiers under my command." Sarah remained silent, her face giving away nothing of what she was thinking. "I've watched you for 2 weeks now," Harrison continued. "You're consistently last in every physical challenge. You struggle with basic combat techniques, and your team suffers because of your limitations. In a real combat situation, those limitations could get people killed." Finally, Sarah spoke. "Is that your official assessment, sir?" "It is. I'm recommending your transfer to a support role where your unique qualities won't be a liability, perhaps intelligence analysis or logistics. Important work, just not frontline combat." Sarah nodded slowly as if considering his words carefully. "And if I refuse the transfer?" Colonel Harrison leaned back in his chair, surprised by her response. Most soldiers in her position would have jumped at the chance for an easier assignment. Refuse, Martinez, you're barely keeping up now. The training only gets harder from here. Advanced tactical maneuvers, survival exercises, specialized weapon systems. You'll be putting yourself and others at risk. I understand the risks, Colonel, but I also understand why I'm here. I didn't join the military to play it safe. There was something in her voice that made Harrison pause. For the first time since her arrival, he heard a steel in her words that didn't match her fragile appearance, but he quickly dismissed it as misguided stubbornness. Very well, he said curtly, but don't say I didn't warn you. Dismissed. As Sarah left his office, Colonel Harrison made a note in her file recommending immediate transfer. If she wanted to be stubborn, he would simply go over her head. The safety of his unit was too important to accommodate one soldier's misplaced pride. The news of Sarah's impending transfer spread quickly through the barracks. Some soldiers expressed relief, while others felt a grudging respect for her determination to stick it out despite the obvious difficulties. Corporal Williams, a 22-year-old from Texas who had shown Sarah small kindnesses during training, approached her during the evening meal. "Hey, Martinez," he said quietly, sliding into the seat across from her in the mess hall. "I heard about the colonel's recommendation." "That's rough." Sarah looked up from her barely touched dinner. "It is what it is, Williams. Can't say it's unexpected. You know," Williams continued, lowering his voice further, "some of us think you've got more heart than half the guys here. Size isn't everything in this job." "Tell that to the colonel," Sarah replied with a bitter smile. "Or better yet, tell it to the enemy when they're shooting at us." Williams wanted to offer more encouragement, but he struggled to find words that wouldn't sound hollow. The reality was that physical capability mattered in their line of work, and Sarah's limitations were undeniable. Still, something about her refusal to quit impressed him. That night, Sarah lay awake in her bunk, listening to the steady breathing of her sleeping bunkmates. She thought about the colonel's offer and the logical arguments he had made. A transfer to intelligence work would be safer, more suited to her apparent capabilities, and would remove the constant stress of trying to keep up with superior physical specimens. But logic had never been what drove her decisions. Logic would have told her to stay home, to find a safe civilian job, to never put herself in situations where her past might be exposed. Logic would have told her to give up the first time she failed a physical fitness test or struggled through basic training. The next morning brought the most challenging exercise yet. A full-day survival course in the nearby wilderness. Teams of 4 soldiers would be dropped at different locations with minimal supplies and given 12 hours to reach a designated extraction point. The course was designed to test not just physical endurance but mental toughness, problem-solving skills, and the ability to work as a cohesive unit under pressure. Sarah was assigned to Team Delta along with Corporal Williams, Sergeant Peterson, and Private First Class Jackson. Peterson made no effort to hide his displeasure with the assignment. "Great," he muttered as they gathered their limited supplies. "We get the weak link. There goes any chance of winning this thing." Williams shot him a warning look, but Peterson was right to be concerned. The survival course had a reputation for pushing soldiers to their absolute limits, and teams were only as strong as their weakest member. As they prepared to board the transport helicopter that would take them to their starting position, Colonel Harrison appeared beside their group. He looked directly at Sarah, his expression making his thoughts clear. "Good luck out there, Martinez," he said in a voice loud enough for the other teams to hear. "Try not to slow your team down too much." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "I'll do my best, sir." "I'm sure you will," Harrison replied with a cold smile. "Your best just might not be enough." As the helicopter lifted off, carrying them toward what would prove to be the most revealing day of Sarah's military career, she pressed her hand against her shoulder again. Soon, very soon, everyone would understand exactly what her best really meant. The colonel's smug confidence would be tested in ways he never expected, and the truth hidden beneath her regulation uniform would finally have its moment to shine. The helicopter dropped Team Delta deep in the Appalachian wilderness, miles from civilization and terrain that challenged even experienced hikers. The morning mist clung to the mountainsides as the 4 soldiers watched their transport disappear into the gray sky, leaving them alone with nothing but basic survival gear and a map, marked with their extraction point 12 miles away. Sergeant Peterson immediately took charge, spreading the map on a fallen log and studying their route options. "All right, people, we've got 12 hours to cover 12 miles through some of the roughest country in the state. The smart play is to stick to the ridgelines where possible. Avoid the valleys where we might get bogged down. Sarah examined the map over his shoulder, noting several alternative routes that might be easier, but would add significant distance to their journey. She started to speak, but Peterson cut her off. Martinez, your job is simple. Keep up and try not to get lost. Williams, you take point. Jackson, you watch our six. I'll navigate and call the shots. The team began their trek through dense forest, with Peterson setting a pace that was aggressive but manageable for 3 of the 4 team members. Within the first hour, Sarah began to fall behind. The uneven terrain, thick underbrush, and steep inclines that the others navigated with relative ease became major obstacles for her smaller frame. Come on, Martinez. Peterson called back in frustration as Sarah struggled to climb over a fallen tree that the others had vaulted easily. We're not even 2 miles in and you're already dragging us down. Williams dropped back to help Sarah over the obstacle, earning a disapproving look from Peterson. We're supposed to be a team, Williams said quietly. Teams help each other. Teams don't carry dead weight, Peterson shot back. At this rate, we'll never make the extraction point, and we'll all fail because of one person who shouldn't be here in the first place. As the morning wore on, the tension within the team grew. Jackson, normally easygoing, began showing signs of irritation as they repeatedly had to wait for Sarah to catch up. Williams remained supportive but was clearly torn between loyalty to a struggling teammate and concern for the mission's success. By midday, they had covered only 6 miles, putting them behind schedule with the most difficult terrain still ahead. The extraction point lay on the far side of a steep ravine that required rappelling down one side and climbing up the other. Peterson called a halt for a brief rest and meal, but his patience was clearly at an end. This isn't working, he announced, studying his watch and the map. We're going to miss the extraction window, and it'll be because we're moving at the speed of our weakest link. Sarah sat apart from the others, eating her rations in silence while examining her own copy of the map. She had noticed something during their morning trek that the others had missed, an alternative route that would be more challenging in some ways, but could save them significant time. However, every time she had tried to contribute to the navigation decisions, Peterson had shut her down. Maybe we should consider splitting up, Peterson continued, his voice carrying a suggestion that everyone understood. 3 of us push ahead to make sure someone from our team reaches the extraction point. Martinez can follow at her own pace, Williams immediately protested. We don't leave anyone behind. That's not how this works. Now what works? Peterson demanded. Failing as a team instead of succeeding partially. At least 3 of us would complete the mission. The argument that followed revealed the deep divisions within the team. Jackson found himself reluctantly agreeing with Peterson's logic, while Williams refused to abandon a teammate. Sarah listened to them debate her fate as if she weren't sitting 10 feet away, and something inside her began to shift. There's another way, she said quietly, but her voice carried in the mountain air. The 3 men stopped arguing and looked at her with varying degrees of surprise and skepticism. What are you talking about? Peterson asked dismissively. Sarah stood and walked to where Peterson had spread the map. With her finger, she traced a route that diverged from their current path. If we drop down into Widow's Valley here and follow the creek bed, we can cut 3 miles off our route. Yes, it means going through water and dealing with some rough terrain, but it avoids the worst of the ridge climbing ahead. Peterson studied the route she was suggesting and shook his head. Widow's Valley is called that for a reason, Martinez. The creek can flood without warning. The terrain is unstable, and if someone gets hurt down there, rescue becomes nearly impossible. It's a stupid risk. Is it more risky than definitely failing the mission? Sarah asked calmly. The question hung in the air as the team members considered their options. They were already behind schedule, and the conventional route Peterson favored would require them to move at a pace that Sarah clearly couldn't maintain. The alternative Sarah suggested was dangerous, but it might be their only chance of success. I don't like it, Peterson said finally. You're talking about gambling all our lives on a shortcut through some of the most dangerous terrain in the area. I'm talking about completing our mission, Sarah replied. Isn't that what we're here for? Williams looked between his teammates, sensing that this moment represented more than just a navigation decision. What makes you so sure about this route, Martinez? You've been struggling with basic hiking all morning. For the first time since the exercise began, Sarah smiled, and there was something in that expression that made all 3 men pause. Because I've been through Widow's Valley before. I know every rock, every bend in the creek, every safe crossing point. The admission hung in the air like a challenge. Peterson's eyes narrowed as he studied Sarah with new attention. When? This is restricted military training ground. Civilians aren't allowed in here. Sarah's smile widened slightly and she began removing her heavy military jacket despite the cool mountain air. Who said anything about being a civilian? As the jacket came off, revealing her regulation t-shirt and the arms beneath it, all three men fell silent. Sarah's left arm, from shoulder to wrist, was covered in an intricate network of scars. Some were thin and precise, clearly from blades. Others were irregular, jagged marks that spoke of explosions and shrapnel. Most prominent was a thick, ropey scar that ran from her shoulder blade to her elbow, the kind left by deep burns. But it wasn't just the presence of the scars that shocked them. It was their arrangement, their pattern, the way they told a story of survival through violence that none of them had expected from the small, seemingly fragile woman they had been protecting and resenting for weeks. "My God," Williams whispered. "What happened to you?" Sarah began rolling up her right sleeve, revealing a similar collection of scars, though these were different in nature. Some were clearly from medical procedures, neat surgical lines that spoke of multiple operations. Others were defensive wounds, the kind acquired when someone raises their arms to protect themselves from attack. "Afghanistan," she said simply, her voice steady despite the weight of the revelation. "3 tours. Widow's Valley got its name from an engagement I was part of 5 years ago. We lost 8 soldiers in that valley, including the team leader who was supposed to guide us through it safely." Peterson's mouth opened and closed without sound as he struggled to process this information. The woman they had dismissed as weak, the soldier they had assumed didn't belong, was revealing a combat history that exceeded any of theirs. "But how?" Jackson managed to ask. "I mean, you've been struggling with everything. The obstacles, the combat training, the physical challenges." Sarah finished rolling up her sleeves and stood with her scarred arms visible in the mountain sunlight. When she spoke, her voice carried a different quality than any of them had heard before, a quiet confidence that commanded attention. "Because I've been hiding what I am, trying to fit in with everyone else's expectations of what a soldier should look like. But maybe it's time to stop pretending to be something I'm not." The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. The way she stood changed, her posture straightening with military bearing that seemed natural rather than practiced. Her movements became more economical, more purposeful. Even her voice carried a new authority that made the 3 men instinctively stand at attention. "Widow's Valley isn't just a shortcut," Sarah continued, studying the map with eyes that now seemed to see tactical possibilities rather than obstacles. "It's a test. The question is whether you trust me to guide you through it, or whether you'd rather explain to Colonel Harrison why your team failed, because you couldn't get past your own assumptions." The descent into Widow's Valley began immediately after Sarah's revelation, but everything about the team's dynamic had shifted. Peterson, who had been dismissive and commanding all morning, now found himself deferring to Sarah's knowledge of the terrain. Williams and Jackson followed her lead with a mixture of curiosity and growing respect as they navigated paths that seemed invisible to them but were clearly familiar to her. "Stay exactly in my footsteps through this section," Sarah instructed as they approached a seemingly innocent stretch of forest floor. The ground looks solid, but there are sinkholes every few yards. During the engagement 5 years ago, Private Morrison stepped 6 inches to the left of the safe path and disappeared up to his chest in mud that nearly drowned him. As they carefully followed her precise route, Peterson couldn't help but ask the question that was consuming him. "Martinez, if you have this level of combat experience, why have you been performing so poorly in training? None of this makes sense." Sarah paused at the edge of a steep drop-off that led down to the valley floor. Below them, a narrow creek wound between moss-covered boulders and fallen trees, creating a natural obstacle course that would challenge even experienced soldiers. "Because," she said, securing her rappelling gear with movements that were now smooth and professional, "I haven't been performing poorly. I've been performing exactly as well as I needed to avoid questions about my past." The admission hit all 3 men like a physical blow. Williams was the first to understand the implications. "You've been hiding your abilities on purpose? But why?" Sarah tested her rope one final time before beginning her descent. "Because the last time people knew what I was capable of, I ended up in situations that cost me everything I cared about." Sometimes being underestimated is the safest place to be. As they rappelled down into the valley, Sarah's movements became increasingly fluid and confident. She navigated the rock face with an ease that spoke of extensive training and experience, reaching the bottom well ahead of the others and immediately securing the area while they completed their descent. The creek bed presented its own challenges. The water was deeper than it appeared from above, with hidden currents that could sweep an unwary soldier downstream. Sarah led them across at specific points where the current was manageable and the footing secure, her knowledge of the terrain proving invaluable. During the firefight, she explained as they waded through waist-deep water, enemy forces had positioned themselves along both ridgelines. This creek bed became our only escape route, but it was also a killing ground. We lost 3 soldiers to sniper fire right about where you're standing now, Jackson. Jackson instinctively looked up at the ridgelines above them, imagining hidden enemies taking aim. The casual way Sarah discussed the deaths of her comrades spoke to a level of combat experience that went far beyond what any of them had suspected. As they moved deeper into the valley, Sarah began sharing more details about the engagement that had given the place its name. She spoke of leading an extraction team to recover wounded soldiers, of making split-second decisions under fire that meant the difference between life and death for her comrades. The picture that emerged was of a soldier who had not only seen extensive combat but had excelled in it. The thing about being small, she said as they navigated around a particularly treacherous section of loose rocks, is that people assume it makes you weak. But in combat, being a smaller target can be an advantage. Being underestimated can be an advantage. And being willing to take risks that larger, stronger soldiers won't consider can be the difference between mission success and failure. Peterson, who had been largely silent during the trek through the valley, finally voiced the question that was bothering him most. If you're this experienced, this capable, why are you here? Why aren't you leading your own unit somewhere? Sarah stopped walking and turned to face him. For a moment, her carefully maintained composure slipped, and they caught a glimpse of something deeper, more painful than physical scars, because 3 years ago, I made a decision that saved my unit but cost me my career. The official records show that I disobeyed direct orders during a rescue mission. What they don't show is that following those orders would have resulted in the deaths of 6 captured soldiers. She resumed walking, but her voice carried back to them as they followed. I chose to save lives over following protocol. My commanding officer chose to save his reputation over supporting his soldier. The soldiers I rescued went home to their families. I went home to a medical discharge and a file full of commendations that I'll never be allowed to talk about. The silence that followed this revelation was broken only by the sound of their boots on whetstones and the gentle murmur of the creek. Each member of the team was processing not just Sarah's words, but the complete reversal of everything they had believed about her. Williams was the first to speak. So you re-enlisted under different circumstances? Started over? Started over with a new name, new records, new identity? Sarah confirmed. The military was the only life I knew, the only place I felt I belonged. But I also knew that my reputation would follow me if I tried to return at my previous rank and experience level, so I chose to start at the bottom to prove myself all over again. But you've been failing every test, every challenge, Jackson pointed out, still struggling to reconcile the capable soldier leading them through dangerous terrain with the woman who had struggled with basic obstacle courses. Sarah smiled grimly. Have I? Or have I been passing a different test entirely? Colonel Harrison wanted to see weakness, so I showed him weakness. The unit wanted to see someone they could dismiss, so I gave them someone to dismiss. But all the while I was learning about each of you, understanding your capabilities, your limitations, your character. They had reached the most dangerous section of the valley, where the creek narrowed between 2 steep walls of rock. The water here moved faster, and the sound echoed off the stone walls in a way that would mask approaching enemies. Sarah motioned for them to stop and take cover behind a large boulder. This is where we lost Sergeant Collins, she said quietly. Sniper fire from the ridge above. He was leading the team when a shot took him down right in the middle of the narrows. After that, I took command and made the decisions that got the rest of us out alive. Peterson studied the terrain with new appreciation for its tactical challenges. How did you get past the sniper positions? By doing something they didn't expect, Sarah replied. Instead of trying to suppress the enemy fire or find cover, I went up the cliff face during the firefight. got behind their positions and neutralized the threat from close range. She pointed to a section of seemingly impossible cliff face. That scar on my shoulder? That's from shrapnel when I used a grenade to take out the sniper nest. The burns on my arm are from the muzzle flash when I had to fight my way through their backup position. As they prepared to move through the Narrows, Sarah's entire demeanor had changed. She was no longer the struggling recruit they had known for weeks. Instead, she had become a combat veteran drawing on hard-earned experience to lead them through genuinely dangerous terrain. Stay low, move fast, and don't stop until we reach the far end, she instructed. Even though this is just training, treat it like the real thing. The skills you practice here might save your life someday when the bullets are real. They moved through the Narrows in tactical formation, with Sarah taking point and the others following her lead with a precision that surprised them all. For the first time since the exercise began, they functioned as a true unit, each member understanding their role and trusting the others to fulfill theirs. As they emerged from the valley and began the final push toward the extraction point, all 4 soldiers had been fundamentally changed by what they had experienced. Sarah had revealed not just her scars but the story behind them, transforming from an apparent liability into an obvious asset. The others had learned that assumptions could be dangerous and that strength came in many different forms. Team Delta reached the extraction point with 45 minutes to spare, making them the first team to arrive despite starting from the most difficult position. The transformation in their group dynamic was complete. Peterson now looked to Sarah for tactical advice. Williams watched her back with the respect reserved for proven leaders, and Jackson followed her orders without question. As they waited for the extraction helicopter, Sarah sat apart from the others, her jacket back on to hide the scars that had revealed so much about her true identity. She watched her teammates with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness, knowing that their newfound respect came with complications she had hoped to avoid. Martinez, Peterson approached her, his earlier hostility replaced by curiosity and respect. I need to ask you something and I want a straight answer. Sarah looked up at him with tired eyes. What do you want to know? Everything you showed us today, everything you're capable of, why hide it? Why let Colonel Harrison think you're incompetent when you could be leading training exercises instead of failing them? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, watching clouds gather on the horizon. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of difficult decisions and painful memories. Because being exceptional comes with expectations I'm not sure I can meet anymore. When people know what you're capable of, they assume you're indestructible. They send you on missions that push the boundaries of what's possible, and eventually those missions break you. She paused, pressing her hand unconsciously against her shoulder where the worst of her scars lay hidden. 3 years ago, I was leading a rescue operation to extract 6 soldiers captured during a reconnaissance mission gone wrong. Intelligence said the enemy was moving the prisoners to a facility where we'd never reach them. Command wanted to wait for more resources, more planning, more backup that might never come. Williams and Jackson had drifted closer, drawn by the quiet intensity in Sarah's voice as she finally shared the story that had defined her life. I made the call to go in immediately with the resources we had. It was the right tactical decision, but it went against direct orders to stand down. We got all 6 soldiers out alive, but the cost was significant. 2 of my team members were wounded. I took shrapnel that should have killed me, and the mission created diplomatic complications that made someone need a scapegoat. Peterson sat down beside her, beginning to understand the full scope of what had happened. They threw you under the bus for saving lives. They did what they thought was necessary to protect larger interests, Sarah replied without bitterness. I understood the politics even as I disagreed with them, but what I didn't understand until later was how the experience had changed me. The nightmares, the hypervigilance, the way every loud sound made me reach for weapons that weren't there. She looked at her hands, remembering holding weapons that had ended lives in service of saving others. When I finally recovered enough to consider returning to service, I realized I had a choice. I could return as the decorated veteran with a file full of commendations and classified operations, which would inevitably lead to more high-stakes missions and more impossible decisions. Or I could start over as someone else, someone ordinary, someone who could serve without carrying the burden of being exceptional. Jackson spoke up, his young voice carrying confusion. But you're still exceptional. What we saw today proves that. You can't just hide that forever, Sarah smiled sadly. Can't I? For 3 months, I've successfully convinced everyone that I'm barely qualified to be here. If today hadn't required my specific knowledge of this terrain, you never would have known the difference." The sound of approaching helicopters interrupted their conversation. In the distance, they could see the extraction aircraft heading toward their position, right on schedule. Soon they would be back at Fort Braxton, where Colonel Harrison would be waiting for reports on how each team had performed. "What happens now?" Williams asked. "Do we tell the colonel what really happened out here?" Sarah stood and adjusted her jacket, once again hiding the evidence of her past. "You tell him that Team Delta completed the mission successfully and arrived at the extraction point ahead of schedule. Everything else is up to you." As the helicopter touched down, sending dust and debris swirling around them, the 4 soldiers prepared to return to base. But the dynamic between them had fundamentally changed. They were no longer 3 experienced soldiers babysitting a weak recruit. They were a team that had been tested and proven, led by someone whose capabilities far exceeded anything they had imagined possible. The flight back to Fort Braxton was mostly silent, each team member lost in their own thoughts about what they had witnessed and learned. Sarah stared out the window at the landscape below, knowing that her carefully constructed facade was beginning to crumble. The other teams would hear about their success, questions would be asked, and eventually someone would start putting pieces together. When they landed at the base, Colonel Harrison was waiting with his usual stern expression and clipboard full of evaluation forms. He watched Team Delta disembark with particular interest, clearly expecting to document Sarah's failure and use it to justify his transfer recommendation. "Team Delta," he called out as they approached. "Report." Peterson stepped forward as team leader, but his eyes briefly met Sarah's before he spoke. "Mission accomplished, sir. Team reached extraction point 45 minutes ahead of schedule." Harrison's eyebrows rose in surprise. 45 minutes ahead? That's the best time recorded today. How did you manage that with... He looked directly at Sarah. "With your team composition. We took an alternative route through Widow's Valley, sir. It was challenging terrain, but it cut significant distance off our travel time." The colonel's expression darkened. "Widow's Valley? That area is marked as high risk on all our training maps. Who made the decision to deviate from the prescribed route?" Sarah felt the moment of truth arriving faster than she had expected. Peterson was looking at her, clearly torn between protecting her secret and giving credit where it was due. Williams and Jackson waited to see what she would choose to reveal. "I did, sir," Sarah said, stepping forward. "I recommended the route change, and Sergeant Peterson agreed to follow my guidance." Colonel Harrison studied her with new attention, his experienced eye noting subtle changes in her posture and voice that he hadn't observed before. "And what made you think you were qualified to make such a tactical decision, Martinez?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah knew that her answer would determine not just her future at Fort Braxton, but whether she could continue hiding from the reputation and expectations that had once defined her military career. Because sometimes, sir, the most dangerous path is also the most direct one to success. It wasn't a complete answer, and everyone present knew it, but it was enough to plant seeds of doubt about who Sarah Martinez really was and what she might be capable of when pushed beyond the carefully maintained limits she had set for herself. Colonel Harrison made notes on his clipboard, but his expression suggested that he was reconsidering some of his earlier assumptions about the small, seemingly fragile soldier standing before him. The conversation wasn't over, but it was clear that it would continue under very different circumstances than he had originally planned. As the team was dismissed, Sarah walked across the compound knowing that her time hiding in plain sight was rapidly coming to an end. The scars she had revealed in Widow's Valley were just the visible evidence of a much deeper story, and that story was about to demand acknowledgement whether she was ready or not. 3 days after the survival exercise, Colonel Harrison sat in his office staring at a classified file that had arrived that morning through secure military channels. The name on the file read, Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez, but attached to it was a recent photograph that showed the face of the soldier he knew as Private Sarah Martinez. The contradiction between the file's contents and his observations over the past month had kept him awake for 2 straight nights. According to the classified records, Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez was a decorated Special Operations veteran with 3 combat tours, multiple commendations for valor, and a reputation for completing impossible missions under extreme circumstances. The file also contained medical records detailing extensive injuries sustained during a classified rescue operation, followed by a medical discharge and psychological evaluation that painted a picture of severe, post-traumatic stress. The final entry in the file was most disturbing of all. Subject disappeared from military medical facility during treatment. Current whereabouts unknown. Consider armed and potentially dangerous due to psychological instability. A knock on his door interrupted Harrison's study of the documents. "Come in," he called, quickly securing the classified materials in his desk drawer. Sarah entered and stood at attention, but Harrison noticed immediately that something had changed about her bearing. The subtle confidence he had glimpsed during the survival exercise was more pronounced now, as if she had decided to stop hiding quite so completely. "You wanted to see me, sir?" Harrison studied her face, comparing it to the photograph in the file. There was no doubt they were the same person, but the woman standing before him seemed somehow diminished compared to the soldier described in her service record. "Have a seat, Martinez. Or should I say Staff Sergeant Vasquez?" Sarah's reaction confirmed what Harrison already knew. For just a moment, her carefully controlled expression slipped, revealing a flash of the combat veteran described in her file. Then her mask returned, but it was too late to deny what he had seen. "I'm not sure what you're referring to, sir." Harrison opened his desk drawer and placed the classified file on his desk where Sarah could see it. Elena Vasquez, age 31, born in San Antonio, Texas. Enlisted at 18, rapid advancement through special operations training, deployed to Afghanistan with Task Force Ranger. Distinguished herself in multiple high-risk operations before being wounded during an unauthorized rescue mission 3 years ago. Sarah's eyes fixed on the file, but she remained silent. Medical discharge due to combat injuries and psychological trauma, Harrison continued. Disappeared from Walter Reed Medical Center during treatment. Officially listed as AWOL and potentially unstable. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice steady despite the weight of the revelations. "That woman doesn't exist anymore, Colonel. She died in a medical facility surrounded by doctors who wanted to fix her mind and politicians who wanted to bury her story." Harrison leaned back in his chair, trying to reconcile the legendary soldier in the file with the apparently broken woman who had been struggling through basic training exercises for the past month. "According to this file, you're one of the most decorated soldiers of your generation. You've completed missions that most Special Forces operatives wouldn't attempt. You've saved more lives than most soldiers see in entire deployments, and yet you've spent the last month pretending to be barely competent at basic military tasks." Sarah looked directly at him for the first time since entering his office. "That's because Elena Vasquez was everything you just described, and it destroyed her. The missions, the decisions, the weight of being responsible for other people's lives in impossible situations. She was exceptional. And exceptional soldiers don't get to retire quietly when their minds break." She paused, her hand unconsciously moving to her shoulder, where Harrison now knew devastating injuries lay hidden. "Sarah Martinez is different. She's ordinary, forgettable, someone who can serve without being asked to be a hero, someone who can follow orders instead of making life and death decisions that haunt her sleep." Harrison studied the woman across from his desk, beginning to understand the full scope of what she had attempted to do. "You created an entirely new identity to escape your own reputation." "I created a new identity to survive," Sarah corrected. "Elena Vasquez was a weapon that the military used until it broke. Sarah Martinez was supposed to be just a soldier, nothing more, nothing less." "But you can't hide what you are," Harrison said, thinking of her performance during the survival exercise. "When the situation demanded it, Elena Vasquez came back. Your teammates saw her, and now I've seen her. The question is what happens next." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, considering her options. The carefully constructed facade that had protected her for months was crumbling, and she faced a choice between continued deception and the truth that might destroy the new life she had built. "What do you want from me, Colonel?" Harrison looked at the file again, then at the woman sitting across from his desk. "I want the truth, all of it. The real story of what happened during that rescue mission, why you disappeared from medical treatment, and how you ended up here under a false identity." Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that once she started telling the real story, there would be no going back to the safety of being ordinary. The rescue mission was in a valley about 60 miles north of Kabul. 6 soldiers from a reconnaissance unit had been captured during a patrol, and intelligence indicated they were being moved to a facility where extraction would be impossible. Command wanted to wait for more resources, more planning, more political clearance as she spoke. Her voice took on the authority and precision that Harrison had briefly witnessed during the survival exercise. But intelligence also indicated that waiting would mean losing those soldiers permanently. I made the tactical decision to proceed with the resources available, knowing it violated direct orders, but believing it was the only chance to save American lives. She described the mission with the clinical precision of a professional soldier, detailing the challenges, the split-second decisions, the casualties sustained, and the ultimate success in rescuing all 6 captured soldiers. The mission was successful by every meaningful metric, she continued. 6 soldiers went home to their families instead of disappearing into enemy custody. But politically, it created complications that someone needed to answer for. Harrison listened to her account, recognizing the type of impossible situation that defined military service in complex operational environments. They blamed you for the political fallout. They blamed me for disobeying orders, which I had done. The fact that disobeying orders was the right tactical decision didn't matter when congressional committees started asking questions about unauthorized operations. Sarah's mask was now completely gone, replaced by the bearing and confidence of the decorated veteran she had once been. The medical discharge was supposed to be temporary, a way to get me out of the spotlight while the political situation cooled down. But during treatment, I realized that returning to my previous role meant accepting that everything that had broken me would eventually happen again, so I chose to disappear instead. Colonel Harrison closed the file and studied the woman who had just revealed herself to be one of the most accomplished soldiers he had ever encountered. And now, Sarah met his gaze with eyes that no longer held any pretense of weakness or uncertainty. Now you have to decide whether Fort Braxton gets Sarah Martinez, who struggles with obstacle courses and needs help with basic combat training, or Elena Vasquez, who completes missions that other soldiers consider impossible. The choice Harrison faced was more complex than simple personnel management. He was looking at a soldier who had deliberately chosen to hide her exceptional capabilities, who had sacrificed recognition and career advancement for the chance to serve without the burden of being extraordinary. "What do you want?" he asked. For the first time since entering his office, Sarah smiled, and it transformed her entire appearance. "I want to be useful, Colonel. I want to serve my country without having to be a hero. But I also understand that some secrets can't be kept forever." Harrison realized that his assessment of this soldier had been completely wrong from the beginning, but not in the way he had originally thought. She wasn't too weak for military service. She was so strong that she had been trying to protect everyone around her from the full weight of what she could do. The colonel who had scoffed at her apparent weakness now found himself facing a decision that would define not just Sarah's future, but his own understanding of what strength really meant in the context of military service.